the next panel. I'd like to welcome Dr. Nadia Brown, Associate Professor, Political Science and African American Studies at Purdue University. I'd like to welcome Judy Wu, Professor in Asian American Studies and Culture and Theory program here at UC Irvine. And we also have Dr. Wendy Smooth, Associate Professor, Women's, Gender, and Sexuality Studies and Political Science at Ohio State, who will be joining us via Skype. Once again, I'd like to welcome Dr. Nadia Brown, Associate Professor, Political Science and African American Studies from Purdue University. I'd like to welcome Dr. Judy Wu, Professor, Asian American Studies and Culture and Theory PhD program here at UC Irvine. And joining us via Skype is Dr. Wendy Smooth, Associate Professor, Women's, Gender, and Sexuality Studies and Political Science at Ohio State University. Let's welcome them. Thank you.
I'm going to be taking the mic. I was hoping to see Wendy. I used to teach at Ohio State. I didn't realize she was Skyping in, but I'm hoping I can stay for that. Unfortunately, I'm going to have to leave this panel a little bit earlier. I teach at 11, so I'm going to have to book over there and get my computer connected for my students. So I want to talk to you both about elections, but also about politics and knowledge more broadly. And I'd like to begin by just giving some of my own personal intellectual biography or activist biography. Hi, Wendy. So I date the beginning of my political identity and my academic yearnings to be a professor to a political protest I was engaged in at Stanford University in 1990. I was a sophomore at that time, and there is an African-American theme dorm at Stanford. It allows anybody who's interested in learning about Black history and culture to live together and to explore those issues. But there were some people on campus who didn't believe that it should exist. So they put up signs with racially derogatory terms. And I joined with a group of people who were multiracial, so African-Americans, Chicano Latinos, Asian Americans, American Indian, white students. And we decided that that was an inappropriate behavior. It should not be something what a university represents. But beyond trying to criticize what the students were doing, we really called for ethnic studies. We wanted students to have the intellectual tools and the knowledge to understand social diversity, to understand power. And we engaged in a series of lobbying efforts, meeting with department faculty, meeting with deans. And it was always, they always told us, well, it's really important, right? We believe in the principle of multiculturalism, we believe in the principle of diversity, but we're not actually going to allocate any funding, right, to hiring faculty or to support student services. So as a result, we took over the president's office. And then after that, there was some movement. So after that, as a result of that, African American Studies was reviewed. Stanford hired its first Asian American Studies professor. Actually, they hired 2 people as a result of the search. And that coalition really came out of an earlier tradition of activism. Students who had organized against apartheid, advocate for divestment. They had also critiqued the idea that Western civilization should be the canon within universities. And so there was a longer tradition of multiracial student activism that really shaped how I became part of a political movement. And as a result of that, I became an American Studies major, but it was my way to do ethnic studies. So I took literature courses from Sandra Drake, looking at African American literature. I was taking classes on constitutional law and civil law through Lucius Barker. And African American Studies was a way for me to, again, get the conceptual tools to think about racial inequality and about resistance. So fast forward now, I recently published a book called Radicals on the Road, and it explores the international activism of Americans during the Vietnam War. Just a really quick thing about the Vietnam War, which I know many of you probably already know. But during the war, the United States dropped 3 times the amount of bombs that they used during World War II. So just imagine World War II, right? It's a global theater war. Triple that, that's the amount of bombs that were dropped on Vietnam, which is a relatively small country. And it wasn't just conventional weapons, but also chemical weapons, right? The use of Agent Orange, defoliants, napalm, and that has had a long-term impact on the people, the landscape of Vietnam. So there's still children being born with birth defects as a result of their parents or their grandparents' exposure to Agent Orange. Twice as many bombs were dropped on the South, which was the United States ally at the time. And there's a famous quote by a US military officer who said, "We had to destroy it in order to save it." That we had to destroy this village in order to save it from communism, or we had to destroy this country in order to save it from communism. So I was really interested in why do people question their nations? When it's time of war, the standard is to accept, right? To say you want to support your nation, you support your national cause. How do people critique that? How do they come to the position to critique that? And I was really interested in travel. How do people cross borders? How do they make connections with people with different nationalities, different racial backgrounds? And how do those experiences of face-to-face contact shape their politics and identities? And instead of focusing on the traditional subjects of American anti-war protests, like white men, I really focused on women. I focused on people of color. So one of the delegations I examined was a delegation that Eldridge Cleaver and Elaine Brown led to Socialist Asia in 1970. They visited North Korea, North Vietnam, China, and they took along a coalition of people of different racial backgrounds and gender backgrounds. And I'm not looking at it in a romantic way. I think there were real tensions and conflicts within the group, and perhaps misunderstandings as well in terms of what they were actually experiencing. But I want to look at these powerful moments of these attempted political connections, and then their historical legacies. I was going to show you some images, but we're going to have Wendy instead, and that's much better. So my current project is on Patsy Mink, and she's the first woman of color to become a US Congresswoman. A lot of people think it's Shirley Chisholm, but it's actually Patsy Mink. Patsy Mink was elected in 1964 from the state of Hawaii. She's a third-generation Japanese-American lawyer, and she and Shirley Chisholm served on the same House committees together, on education, on social welfare. They also ran for the presidency at the same time, so in 1972. And because they were allies, they were political allies, they agreed not to run in each other's state primaries. So I guess one of the things that we should know Patsy Mink for is that she not only co-sponsored but really defended Title IX. And after she passed away in 2002, they renamed Title IX after Patsy Mink. So this is kind of an unexpected place to find a Japanese American woman, Asian American woman, redefining gender politics on college campuses and really in American society. Since my own background is in grassroots activism, and my previous work has been on grassroots activism, it's interesting now for me to think about trying to study someone who's in Congress, right, who's in the halls of power, even though she herself has been marginalized in many ways. Being from Hawaii, when she first went to Congress, as part of the publicity promotional tours, people asked her to dance the hula. They commented on her physical beauty, saying, "Oh, she's pretty and pert, and she has political ideas," right? But I really want to think about ways in which she's connecting congressional politics with grassroots politics. So one example of that, she introduces federal legislation for federally funded childcare in the late 60s, and it's an ongoing battle that she keeps on bringing up year after year. Obviously, childcare is something that is a concern to women, especially women of color who have large concentrations in the workforce, right, who participate in greater numbers in the workforce. And it's something that she herself has to navigate when she's living her life. She became a lawyer in the early 1950s, graduated from the University of Chicago. Nobody would hire her, right? She's a woman of color. She's also a mother of a relatively young child. She ends up working as a librarian instead in Chicago. She goes back to Hawaii. And again, nobody would hire her, right? She's a person of color in a very stratified, racially hierarchical society in Hawaii that's dominated by the plantation societies. So she ends up having to just hang a shingle and taking whatever cases she gets. And as an example of this, her first payment was a fish, right? Her clients are poor people, and they're bartering their services with her. And as she's dealing with these issues, she's trying to figure out, what do I do with my daughter? When she goes to Congress, what her daughter does for childcare is to roam the halls of Congress. She just goes into different congressional offices and talks to people about politics. So this is Wendy Mink, or Gwendolyn Mink, which some of you might know. But she's a political scientist, or was a political scientist for a long period of time. She's more recently retired. So she's bringing her experiences, her personal experiences as a woman of color, to Congress. There's also a longer tradition of laboring women needing childcare in Hawaii, and I think that longer tradition leaves an imprint on her politics. I mentioned before, Hawaii is a highly stratified plantation society, a plantation economy that was introduced as haoles, as whites arrived on the islands, transforming these islands from native kingdoms, right, into commercialized agriculture. And initially, there was effort to try to exploit Native Hawaiian laborers, but eventually these plantation owners turned to racialized labor from around the world. So that's when they recruit people from Japan, from China, from the Philippines, from the Caribbean. Even Portuguese are brought in some ways as an intermediate strata, right? They're not Haole, they're not plantation owners, but they're overseers. So they have a little bit of social status, but not the same, right, as the people who own the plantations. And Japanese women especially were recruited. They didn't want just to have immigrant men on these plantations. They thought they were too unruly. They thought they were socially disruptive. They were going to drink too much. They're going to gamble too much. So they wanted women to come as well as a civilizing influence. But these women were also needed in the fields. So they worked along with their husbands in the fields. There was no childcare, right? If you get pregnant, you work until you give birth, and you come back right away. Right? There's no paid maternity leave. There's no childcare support either, right? So what ends up happening are groups of women might have an older person check on their children while the women are working in the fields. And it's backbreaking and very dangerous labor. What happens with sugarcane is that it keeps on growing till it reaches this incredible height. Then they burn the fields. That's how you process sugar. But during the burning of the fields, right, children could get lost in the fields, right? They can die as a result of that experience. And even though the owners are trying to bring in women as a civilizing influence, they become a catalyst for labor organizing. So they're arguing for higher wages, for better working conditions, and also parental leave, right, maternity benefits. So I think this tradition of being from the plantations, being from a working class background, the need and recognition of women's needs in terms of labor and childcare has an impact on what Patsy Mink introduces in Congress. So those are some of the ideas that I'm exploring in my current project. So I'll end here.
Dr. Smooth, will you go ahead and present next?
Oh, great, thank you. Are you all able to hear me?
Yes.
Oh, wonderful crowd. First, I want to offer my sincere thanks to Tiffany and her team, and to the Association for the Study of Black Women in Politics, in particular its founder, Nicole Alexander Floyd, for their infinite wisdom in bringing this conference together. And I am so sorry that I am unable to be with you all in the room. So many friends and people that I deeply love to talk with are in that room. And so even up until a day ago, I wanted to have a note on my pillow and on my door that said, "Ran away to Irvine, represent me in the company of my sisters." So I really did want to be there. I'm focusing my remarks and comments today largely based upon the theme of the conference. I'm really moved by the theme and the call of the conference, Scandal in Real Time. And it's helping me to think critically through how Black women in political science have engaged us regarding scholarly inquiry on Black women as political actors. And in particular, I'm interested in the ways in which these actors as participants in formal politics. So we do have this long history of social and civic activism. You can search through the movement of history and see the spaces and faces of African American women's imprint. But when we start to think about formal electoral politics, the story becomes critically a story of erasure until fairly recent development in the scholarly literature on women of color in politics and Black women in particular as political actors. So in my comments today, I will focus on how I have donned my own version of the Olivia Pope-esque strut through my scandal, you just want to get up and walk your side first. I mean, it's just walking down the hall. There's a power, a walk that's a particular type of power. So locations? What's the power, what's the force do we bring as fixtures? And I'm locating myself as both a political scientist and a scholar of women's gender and sexuality studies, and having a little bit of displacement in both of those spaces that I'll speak to in my comments. So part of my work has been locating and asserting Black women at the scene of electoral politics, and the roles they play both as voters and elected officials fixing the political landscape in hopes of enriching political representation and notions of democratic inclusion for all citizens. So I center my work on fixing facts, right, and realities of Black women's power in formal electoral politics. I focus my attention on the inside, the protest politics that happens inside of institutions, the spaces where Black women operate as elected officials, yet still occupy spaces as outsiders. And they are still compelled to make spaces for themselves when few in the institution welcome, recognize, note, or respect their presence. As institutional insiders, we imagine that they've crossed over, become a part of the system, and recognize the system. But my research shows that nothing could be further from their reality. About a decade ago, it's hard to say a decade ago in my work, I published what has become a well-cited article in then an emerging journal called Politics and Gender. And in that article, the article was titled Intersectionality in Electoral Politics, a Mess Worth Making. In that article, I was attempting to fix what I saw as grave omissions in understanding of elections and voting and the impact of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, given our tendencies to focus on discrete categories of either race or gender, and our failures to examine the intersections of race and gender. And as I was reflecting on this talk and thinking about that article, just 10 years ago, we were celebrating this idea that we were not only renewing the Voting Rights Act of 1965 through the authorization process, we were also celebrating and renaming it after African American women heralds of the civil rights movement and the quest for greater voter inclusion. And here we sit some 10 years later, and the Supreme Court has effectively gutted the most effective aspect of the Voting Rights Act. And in this 2016 election, we're actually moving through the first election cycle without the protections of the Voting Rights Act. And so one of the things that I think we as scholars and activists need to be particularly aware of are the voter suppression tactics that we have already seen come to fruition in the absence of the Voting Rights Act and the protections that extend. We've got a long road to go to build, repair, resuscitate those protections. But in that article 10 years ago, celebrating the passage of the reauthorization of the Voting Rights Act, one of the things I was employing us as scholars, as pundits, activists to do is to reframe our conversations on elections, voting, on the Voting Rights Act and its impact by looking at those issues using an intersectional frame, right? And one of the things that we can claim, there are many of us in the room who've been a part of these efforts, so I certainly don't claim to sit at that table alone. And in fact, we see more scholars sitting at the table of ushering in a robust usage of intersectionality in political science, across the social sciences. And many of you are in the room, so thank you for also building in that work. But one of the things that we know is that when we utilize an intersectional frame, we begin to ask different questions. And the knowledge that gets produced from the questions that we're asking are radically different. So in that article, I was early on asking us to think differently about who is voting, right? Who shows up to the polls, a more refined look at who is voting. And I talked about the emergence of a new American voter. In part, thinking about the shifts and changes in the political terrain for African American voters, particularly as we're seeing incarceration rates rise for African American men, which has meant the loss of the vote and access to the vote in many states, which essentially left Black women as the voters of the Black community. Yet we had no language to talk about Black women as voters. We talk, and we still do, are guilty of this, of talking about the quote Black vote without really having a sense of disaggregating what that looks like Black gender. And we've learned over time that Black women actually do vote slightly different from their Black male counterparts. In that article, I also asked us to look at who is responsible for the growth in the numbers of Black elected officials. We were starting to see shifts as early as the late 1990s in terms of the election of Black elected officials. And if you look at those numbers closely, particularly at the state level, you'll see that a lot of the growth in terms of Black elected officials is attributable to African American women running and being successful in their candidacy. But without taking an intersectional approach, we're unable to have that critical conversation and drill down in the data in that way. We also, by not looking at these intersections, I argued at that time, we were not fully aware of how to explain the plateau that we were seeing in women moving into state legislative office. We often placed a lot of emphasis on state legislatures and the state level office as a stepping stone to higher office. After the 1990s, Year of the Woman, 1992, we had an unprecedented number of women moving into state houses across the country and into Congress. We talked about the Year of the Woman, and after that, we saw a plateau in terms of the numbers of women moving into political office. And we were worried about that. And one of the things that I talked about in this article 10 years ago was that we needed to start to look at women of color and the roads that they were taking into political office, starting to look at what was happening if we disaggregate the group women and disaggregate that by race and gender. Look, we have a different story to tell. The numbers were small, but when we disaggregated those numbers by race and gender, we had a very different story of who was entering into state houses across the country, who was becoming involved as elected officials at the state level. We saw that African American women's numbers were steady ticking up, and the same is true for Latinas. And we didn't have a language, again, to talk about that. So when we talk about inroads in our work or the impact of our work on the field, one of the things that we have to think about is how has the scholarship changed over time. And I'm happy to say in some parts, we are having a different set of conversations. For those of us who've been working on these topics for years, we're seeing some shifts and changes in terms of how people talk about their data and an interest in doing the important work of drilling down. In all of these instances that I'm mentioning, our rereading of these areas brings up a different set of questions. We're now at a point of asking a different set of questions about the presence of African American women in elected bodies, the paths that they take. Nadia's work is helping us to understand the generational differences that exist among state legislators in terms of when they enter into legislative office and how their experiences, both as younger women and as older women, can really impact the types of questions that they ask inside of institutions. So we've opened up and made some significant headway in terms of changing or producing or increasing, I should say increasing, the amount of knowledge that we have about women of color in electoral politics, about Black women in electoral politics. So the knowledge that we produce from making that mess is profound. And one of the areas I'll point to outside of the state legislature is that when we look at electoral politics, in 2008, we had a very different way of talking about the Black vote. We went through South Carolina, the South Carolina Democratic Party primary in 2008. I remember so clearly this really excruciating interview that Anderson Cooper had with some of our colleagues in terms of trying to talk through this really cumbersome thing, intersectionality. And we were all trapped in the jargon of about how to talk about this profound moment where we were finally able to recognize that Black women vote differently than white women, Black women vote differently from Black men, and different issues spark their understanding of politics and the way that they resonate around certain issues. So in 2008, we started to have a clumsy public conversation about intersectionality. By 2012, we were well versed in trying to talk about the new American electorate, the new tapestry of voters that are driven by women of color and their intensity of support for Democratic candidates. And I imagine that we're going to continue to have that conversation throughout this political season as the heft of the election in 2016 will again rest on Black voter turnout, but even more specifically, it will rest on the turnout of African American women. And political operatives are starting to understand that. And I think it's only through the work of myself and other scholars in the room and those of us who have been pushing to ask the additional questions around the presence and importance and significance of Black women in electoral politics. Do we ask those questions differently? So what I've come to understand through my own scholarship and the work of so many of you in the room is that for Black women, we can actually never rely on the cavalry to come in and rescue the points of exclusion, erasure, or disregard for the experience. The cavalry, the legions, the horse brigade, mounted up and ready to fight for our place just ain't coming. So it's going to be like our foremothers. We'll need to don our best Olivia Pope suit and begin to fix a few things on our own. Addressing the things we can fix on our own is not to be confused at all with not insisting on others to do their part and take responsibility for the role they play in maintaining the status quo in the academy. Now, I want to point out, as I'm moving to close, that when I say the role that others play in maintaining the status quo in the academy, while my article and other things that I've written, those of you in the room, we all know this story all too well. Our work is often not cited in the ways that it should be cited. It is not recognized. There's a whole movement afoot across the social sciences, recognizing that women know things and should be quoted as such. So this is not a small thing. It's something that we need to take quite seriously, how our work is treated. So a few things I'd like to employ as I come to a close and really have the collective body to help us think about is that I got a few fixes in mind, right? Since the cavalry ain't coming.
Okay.
Fix number one, we have to ask ourselves, in the work you're doing, have you cited a Black woman? Have you sought insights on women of color in relation to your work? Are you training, this is a really serious bone I have right now, are you training your graduate students to be rigorous scholars? And what I mean by that is requiring that their written, regardless of topic, go beyond citing only those articles appearing in the so-called top-tier journals that pop up in their JSTOR searches first. So many of our students and junior scholars come to understand the JSTOR search tool as knighting what constitutes good scholarship, not recognizing the politics of the algorithm that makes certain articles reappear as the quote top articles and quote top journals. What we know is that few articles, particularly those in the social sciences, are actually published in our top political science journal, focusing on African American women and women of color in politics. As a field, we have a bias in studies and qualitative work that is reflected in the silencing and erasure of Black women's stories. So the question is, are we introducing young scholars to the countless collections and edited volumes and anthologies where Black women's voices are most likely to appear? These are not the top journal articles, but they are profoundly amazing anthologies where we need to insist that our students are not only reading those works from our graduate courses, but that we're insisting on those being cited. One article I'll turn your attention to is by our colleague Nicole Alexander Floyd, written, published, cross-indexed, and footnoted, producing Black female PhDs and Black women's and gender studies scholarship in political science, where she takes up a number of these issues and compels us to think critically about our citation practice. Fix number 2, and I'm closing. Fix number 2. The role of the social scientist in Black feminist spaces is one that we must interrogate. Social scientists, in particular political scientists, who do empirical analyses of social problems and conditions, are engaged in theorizing Black women's lives and should be recognized as such by the community of scholars engaged in Black feminist and women of color theorizing. Black women's lives are profoundly shaped by the formal institutions of society, legislatures, city councils, the UN Security Council, and by social systems of inequity, healthcare, the economy, labor regulations, the prison industrial complex, and global trade. These two are issues of Black feminism, and once occupied a central role in what we understood as Black feminist thought, and once occupied a central space in women of color feminism. As much as I love a good critique of Beyonce's feminism as excellent, we as Black women social scientists do not see Black feminist theory as the sole purview of popular cultural analytics. I want to be in the room. Our critical voices on the institutions and political arrangements undergirding our economy and political system are necessary and urgent. I would like to see us as Black feminist scholars strike greater balance. Strike greater balance regarding what constitutes Black feminism in our courses, in the anthologies that we put together, in our conference organizing, in our discussions. If we don't take heed, we risk training a generation of scholars who lack the tools to empirically reckon with the brutality of institutions for Black women and women of color. The fixes I'm advocating in my own scholarship and asking us to consider as a collective is about claiming a space for Black women's voices in a critical, in-depth, scholarly engaged way. Love the conversation.
All right, so how do I follow that? Yes. All right. Well, thank you. So many thanks to those of you that are in the room. Particularly, I want to thank my mom who has traveled with me. And allows me to be a working mama. I want to really thank Tiffany, who secured funding for my mother to come to the conference and to be a full participant, and the commitment that the University of California, Irvine, and the conference organizers have had to really prioritizing family and our full selves as academics, as scholars, as women, as mothers, and the multiple roles that we fill. I also want to give a special shout out to my mentors in this room because mentorship matters. I am here today because of these women, and I hope to give back to the same way that these women have poured into my life. So big shout outs to Dr. Alexander Floyd, Dr. Julia Jordan-Zachary, Wendy Smooth, and Evelyn Simeon. Lakita Bonnet, who was my roommate at Bunch 13 years ago. We started this journey together. And to my academic big sister, Zenzilia Izoke, who got her PhD years ahead of me at Rutgers and who really paved the way as an example for what I should be doing and what I could hope to achieve. So what all these women are doing, they are shaping the discipline to make sure that our voices are heard. And I don't take that lightly. Indeed, I build on what they have done to kind of center the things that I would want to do. So I have a commitment to watering the grass where I am. I want to make political science a much more inclusive space for our voices, to understand that you just can't have us as window dressings to diversify our departments or our programs or our colleges, but to actually pay attention to the things that we have to say, to understand our scholarship and to engage with this. So the backstory of how I came to political science is a long story that kind of started in childhood, where I grew up in a community seeing Black women active in politics. I saw Black women as leaders in churches, in community organizations, but I never saw Black women as leaders, formal titles of leaders, right? So Black women were always leaders, but we just didn't have the titles. I went to Howard University in the fall of 2000, where it was all Black politics all the time. And it was really Black men, right? So again, I'm really thankful to Dr. Jay-Z for providing that lone voice of Black feminism in my early career as a political scientist at Howard. I was accepted to a PhD program at Rutgers University in 2004, where it was all white women's politics all the time. And I was a major in the subfield of women in politics. And there I have a mentor in Dr. Alexander Floyd, who was able to provide that Black feminist voice there at Rutgers. But for the most part, right, I was kind of operating within these spaces that I had to go out and seek mentors. I had to go out and seek the scholarship that wasn't provided in those canonical spaces, both at Howard and at Rutgers. So I sought to write a dissertation that really wanted to look at Black women's politics. And I wanted to center the voices of why were these women that were so profound, that were doing such great, amazing political work, why were they so silent? And I had the fortunate opportunity to have some amazing women on my dissertation committee, Wendy Smooth being one of them, who helped to really provide the resources and the mentorship that allowed me to kind of answer these questions. But I still had to write a dissertation that would get me a degree. So this dissertation was not the one that I necessarily wanted to write, but I was asked to compare white men, white women, Black men, Black women, Asian American women and men, Latinos and Latinos to Black women, and kind of ask in a kind of comparative question, what makes Black women different? And again, this was from this deficit model, right? What makes them different as in a negative way. So when I graduated and I got my PhD, I was then able to, as my dissertation co-advisor Jane Junn said, was kind of make this baby my own. I was able to kind of, she said, co-parent as she was stepping away and allowing me to kind of write the book that I wanted to write. So that was my 2014 book, Sisters in the State House, where I was able to really just look at the intergroup differences of Black women. And that for me was more telling, right? So the importance of the intergroup politics, thinking about generation, motherhood status, nationality, class, partnership status, sexual orientation, and how these different identities were calculus for how Black women saw themselves and how they operated in the world politically. But what started with that was I had to listen to Black women themselves. I couldn't take a priori that race or gender was this operating factor and it would work in a particular set of ways. But I had to listen to the women, state legislators, really intently for them to tell me how, when, and where race and gender mattered. And it really just wasn't race and gender, right? We know that there's, as intersectional scholars, that there are all these other compacting factors that matter in how Black women operate politically. Now, why does this matter? Because the literature shares that Black women are the most cohesive political group, right? They're more likely to vote the same way than any other group. And so what my dissertation, one of my co-chairs shared, and kind of my training at Rutgers was, that's not a story, right? These women are all voting the same way. They have the same political calculus. Why should we even study them? That's why I had to do this comparative study with these different groups. And what I wanted to show was if they vote the same way, they might have arrived at these same decisions with a different political calculus. And if we're only looking at roll call votes or bill sponsorship, we're missing the nuances in how Black women are operating and how they're thinking about the world. And what informs their thinking about the world are these identity structures. And it's really important to understand how there are complications, nuances, dynamisms within these different identities that enable them to think about themselves as political actors and who are they impacting as their constituents. So that was the work that I did in the first book, Sisters in the State House. And my new work, again, centers on Black women's narratives to really give voice to those that are often studied but not heard. So I want to be really intentional on using these women's voices and less of my own, right? So as a scholar, I'm providing the academic framework and the lens, but I'm letting their voices shine through. And why is that important? I think that because us as a discipline in political science, we are kind of this face dressing, right? We're kind of the window treatment into this pretty house that's supposed to be political science, that we want to be looked at, seen, but not necessarily heard. So because of those things, I have kind of now post-tenure transformed some of my energies or efforts into some of the APSA initiatives that want to have women of color, but don't necessarily want to listen to us. So have leadership positions on the Committee for the Status of Women in the Profession, the Women's Caucus, and I'm also one of the representatives. I'm the chair of the Ralph Bunche Alumni Association. And what I'm doing in these institutional formats, or I'm able to push the question, some of the things that Wendy Smoove talked about, and I loved how she laid out these fixes, right? So what are you doing to cite a Black woman? Have you sought the insights of women of color in your work? And oftentimes, it's not just being at the table to advocate for yourself, but it's advocating for our sisters that are in the room. And I see my work on these boards as reminding folks, it's great to have me sit here, but what about the others that you have not engaged with? Part of that, I've been asked to serve on the editorial board of Women Also Know Stuff, which I think Wendy alluded to, and I would urge you all to join. It's just womenalsoknowstuff.com. But it's a crowdsourced website where women, particularly women in political sciences, are asked to sign up and just list your areas of expertise. And it's twofold, right? So the website is first for ourselves internally as political scientists, talking about why are there so many all-male only panels, and particularly panels that have no people of color whatsoever. And so part of what has been said is there's this implicit bias that because of networking, people are likely to ask people that they know to serve on panels. So I don't know someone who does this kind of work. It doesn't mean that they don't exist. So that's what the website is supposed to help with. The other part, help with outreaching to media. And this is also what Wendy shared, that media doesn't really know necessarily what to do with intersectional questions. And thinking about the complexities of, we know the Black woman's vote is important, or the Black vote is important, but who do we talk to and who do we go to talk with? And I would even add a caveat on to Wendy's point about Black women playing a particular role in this 2016 election, to think about the role of Black young women, right? And kind of how there's this really interesting split or dynamism going on between older women of civil rights generation or having some kind of historical linkages to the Clintons, and then those younger women and millennials like myself who are leaning more towards Bernie and are putting more pressure on the Clintons to really engage with issues that affect younger Black people, and even thinking about some of Hillary's kind of contentious relationships with Black Lives Matter, right? And kind of touting on some of the mothers of the movement, but not necessarily engaging with the issues that their children necessarily faced, right? And then lastly, I am now starting in January as the co-lead editor of Politics, Groups, and Identities, which is an interdisciplinary journal that Valeria Sinclair Chapman and myself are the co-lead editors. And I would ask for you to please submit your manuscripts, thank you to the journal, because one, we want to really be, so we really want to be inclusive of the kind of interdisciplinary work that is going on in our fields, but having two Black women serve as lead editors of a mainstream journal in political science is new, and we want to really push the boundaries on what is considered political science, right? So I am now working with a co-author on a special issue of body politics, and we received lots of submissions from folks in many different subfields and many different disciplines, which is really important. And I think political science needs to do more of understanding where other disciplines are asking questions about politics or asking questions about citizenship and power, but because they don't fall within the same canons, are often dismissed. So I'm bringing in an interdisciplinary scholar like myself and Valeria, we're able to kind of make these connections. So I'm asking you please to submit your manuscripts to this journal. And then I know I have such a short number of time that's left, so I'm going to scroll really quickly through. I had 9 pages of talking points, which I know we will not be able to get to. So let me just kind of scroll quickly. So lastly, I want to just conclude that as agents of knowledge, right, Black women draw from their individual lived experiences, and they are placed within a particular set of material, historical, and epistemological conditions to anchor specific knowledge claims. So my work often centers on the voices of Black women political actors that presents them as authoritative subjects. And again, this is a radical move in political science, to actually listen to folks that you are studying and use their own words to articulate why they see politics a certain way. Right. And so what my work does, and I think the work of a lot of us in the room and what this conference seeks to show, right, is how experience often provides a more complex and nuanced understanding of how these race and gender identities impact what we do, either as scholars or as political subjects. Political scientists often take this really utilitarian view towards data and analyze them as a result that fails to really capture the dynamisms of Black women's political identities, as well as their race-gendered experiences of these political actors. So my work takes race-gendered identities as a starting point of analysis and then moves forward, right? So I think it's really important to, again, center Black women's narratives to understand how they believe their identities make an impact on the myriad of political phenomenon. And drawing from our oral histories that we'll do here today, I think this will kind of continue the trajectory of this kind of work that really seeks to prioritize Black women as agents of knowledge production. Yeah.
So Dr. Smooth and Brown, we have time for a few questions. We probably have time for about literally 2 questions. So I want to open the floor up. You've raised many really important concerns and issues. Did I see a hand? Okay, so I had a couple myself that I'm hoping that you all will consider taking up. Oh, there's a hand. Oh, thank you. Thank you, Rolda.
Dr. Smooth, I'm looking for an ally. I am one of my only friends who, sees the choices the Supreme Court made about the VRA as more of an opportunity than a decimation of the legislation. In that it was obvious to everyone involved that the equations, the algorithms, whatever you want to call it, that were being used to determine which areas of our country needed to be reassessed or needed to be submitted or subjected to watch by the Department of Justice as far as voting rights. That calculation, that equation needed to be changed because it was no longer timely and it was no longer catching locations that were subjecting voters to voter suppression. Considering your analysis about the role of Black women in the electorate, the increased role of Black women, the fact that Black women vote differently, wouldn't you, or I shouldn't say would you say, can you take my side and say that the electorate has changed, the equation needs to be changed, the consideration that the VRA takes into account needs to be changed. So stripping it, the way the Supreme Court has done, is an opportunity for Congress to get its act together, rewrite the portions of the VRA, and make it fit the times of our new electorate.
Yes, excellent question. So here's the thing I would say. We engaged in extremely risky politics with the script So life gives you, my Beyonce moment, life gives you lemons, what do you do with it? Make lemonade, right? So what's the lemonade that we can make in this post-voting rights moment? And I agree with you about a component of the way that you set up the question about the changing dynamics of the electorate. But I also would uplift the changing nature of racism in this country, right? And by saying that, I would say that the calculations, the equations were always focused on the former states of the Confederacy, right? But one of the places that we have seen post the DRA the most outlandish violations of voter suppression was in Arizona, right? Most recently. And so that's a very different calculation, right? Arizona would not have been covered in the same way under the Voting Rights Act, given the way that the Voting Rights Act was initially constructed. So in terms of lemonade, I think we have an opportunity. We can look at this as a moment of opportunity with the right Congress in place to actually write a more expansive voter protection set of laws that is not relegated only to the states of the former Confederacy, but that is nationwide. And in that way, we are cognizant of what happens in a state like Ohio, where I live, where we are notorious for closing down a number of polling places just weeks before the election, and we talk about it as an economic decision versus a voter suppression decision. And with a more robust set of voter protection laws that focus nationwide, I think we can address some of the issues that we know are in play. So definitely, I think we have an opportunity to only with the right Congress.
So I'm going to take the chair's privilege and thank this wonderful panel for being here and for the technical assistance that made this possible. And not only did Dr. Brown come with family to remind us and reinforce our connections to intergenerational support and research and everything that makes what we do actually matter. When I said to her, my campus doesn't support childcare for visiting working faculty members, she sent me the entire reading list of the people who were doing the research nationally on that. And so if you looked at the program, because this is a problem that's endemic. It's a problem that's endemic. It's something that actually needs to be changed at policies at all of the universities. And so if you look in the program at the end, I just simply cut and paste Dr. Brown's reading list of people and her instructions about what to do. So please do that when you go back to your house. Ask your faculty senate and academic welfare committee, ask the chair of your department, what is our policy? Do we support childcare when people are coming to do research work, particularly places that call themselves Research One universities? Do we support elder care and companion care? And if we claim we're institutions of access, then we need to do that or be actionable. Two choices, access or actionable. Thank you, everybody.